It was a crisp October evening in 2015 when 15-year-old Ethan Ross, just a regular teenager, left his home in Clearwater, California, for what seemed like a simple ride on his bike. The autumn air was cool, the sky turning shades of orange and purple as the sun began to dip behind the hills. He'd texted his best friend earlier, saying he'd be back before dinner. But something was different that night. The last message he sent was chilling. "There's a strange car following me." That was it. No more texts. No more calls. Ethan Ross disappeared without a trace that evening. His bike was found, abandoned, along a quiet country road, the front wheel bent, as if it had been tossed aside in haste. But where was Ethan? As the hours passed, panic set in. His parents, Craig and Pam Ross, immediately began their search, driving through the neighborhood, calling friends, knocking on doors. The entire community, normally so peaceful, was shaken to its core. Everyone was looking for Ethan, but no one could find him. Local volunteers formed search parties, scouring the nearby woods and fields, while law enforcement launched a full investigation. Every lead was followed, every road was searched, but there was no sign of Ethan, no clues, no answers. His family clung to hope, hoping he had just wandered off, hoping he would return. But as each day passed, the hope began to fade. And then came the discovery: the bike left in a secluded forest. The very sight of it sent waves of fear through the community. The bike wasn't just abandoned, it was a clue, a sign that something had gone terribly wrong. The town was on edge. Fear spread like wildfire. Parents pulled their children closer, not knowing what had happened to Ethan, but fearing the worst. What happened that night? What had Ethan seen? What could have happened to him? The mystery of Ethan's disappearance was only beginning to unfold, and the more questions that were asked, the more terrifying the answers seemed to be. Before I begin, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. I'd love to know just how far this story's reaching. Ethan's parents, Craig and Pam Ross, sat in the living room of their home, staring at the empty space where their son's belongings once lay. His bike, his shoes, his jacket, all scattered in the hallway as if he'd just stepped out for a moment. They tried to tell themselves that maybe he'd just gotten lost, that maybe he'd gone on a spontaneous adventure, as teenagers sometimes do. But the hours stretched into days, then into weeks, and the gnawing, silent terror began to take root. They couldn't understand. How could a bright, innocent 15-year-old boy simply disappear? How could this happen to them, to their family? Their son Ethan was a child like any other, excited for the future, full of potential, eager to explore. One moment, he was talking about his plans for the weekend. The next, he was gone. Pam couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the only image that haunted her was that of Ethan's bike, found abandoned along a quiet road. It was a stark symbol of everything they had lost in a matter of hours. Craig, too, couldn't escape the hollow weight of that emptiness. Every corner of the house felt colder without Ethan's laugh, his energy filling up the space. They didn't know what to think, what to believe, but they knew they had to keep looking. The search parties grew in size, and still, there were no answers. Volunteers combed through the wooded areas, through trails, under bridges, around every corner of the town. Law enforcement worked tirelessly, but every lead they followed seemed to hit a dead end. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months, and each passing moment only deepened the despair. Pam stood by the window, her eyes scanning the street outside, hoping for any sign, any familiar figure to appear. Her thoughts were tangled. Was he lost? Was he hurt? Was he even alive? Every day felt like an eternity. The phone never rang with good news. The posters on street corners, once bright and hopeful, began to fade and peel. They were a reminder of a child who might never come back. As the weeks turned into months, the emotional toll on the family became more evident. Craig tried to stay strong, holding it together for Pam, for their friends, for the hope of finding their son. But deep down, he felt the cold hand of hopelessness creeping in, threatening to take over. Every new missing person case that made the news felt like another blow to his heart. It reminded him that Ethan's story was slipping further from the minds of the public. What if, after all this, people forgot? What if they stopped looking? Pam, too, found it harder to hold on. Every morning she woke up, the absence of Ethan hit her like a wave, raw, heavy, and unrelenting. She clung to the small, flickering hope that one day her son would walk through the door, safe and sound. But each day that hope seemed to fade, like a dream slipping through her fingers. But despite the heaviness, they couldn't give up. They had to believe that Ethan was out there somewhere, waiting to be found. That's when they decided to take the next step, to keep his memory alive, to keep his name in the public eye. In 2016, just 1 year after Ethan disappeared, Craig and Pam established the Sean Hornbeck Foundation. They didn't want Ethan to become just another cold case. They wanted to do something, anything, to help other families like theirs who were searching for lost children. The foundation was created to support other families in crisis, those who found themselves in the same terrifying situation, without answers, without closure. But in doing so, they were also holding on to the sliver of hope that someday someone would help them find their son. It was an act of defiance against the despair. Time marched on, relentless and unforgiving. Ethan's case was filed away in the annals of missing persons cases. New stories emerged. New faces disappeared. But Ethan's case, despite the Foundation's efforts, began to feel like a distant memory to many. The community, once so full of hope, began to carry on with their lives. School events took place. People moved. Families grew. But for Craig and Pam, time seemed to stand still. How could they live in a world where their son was still out there, but no one could find him? Craig couldn't bear the thought of how his family's life had been hijacked by one person, one horrible event. How could it have come to this? Their world had stopped, but everyone else's had continued. How long could they hold on to hope? How long before it felt like nothing more than a cruel joke? And then came the day when Craig heard something that would change everything. The phone call came at 3 a.m., a time when no one expected good news. But what he heard next would haunt him forever. A piece of information, a clue had surfaced. A video that might hold the key to solving Ethan's disappearance. Something he never imagined could happen. Before we continue, I just want to take a moment to thank all of you, my amazing subscribers, for supporting this channel and helping it grow. If this story has touched you as deeply as it has touched me, please hit that like button. It really helps spread the word. If you're new here, subscribe to this channel so you never miss another shocking, true crime story. Share this with someone who needs to hear how Ethan's case unfolded. Trust me, they won't want to miss this. And don't forget to turn on that notification bell so you're the first to know when I drop more gripping videos like this one. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Months turned into years, 4 long years without answers. As time passed, the search for Ethan Ross grew quieter. The posters that once covered the walls of every school, every community center, faded into the background. His face, once seen on billboards and news reports, slowly slipped into the recesses of people's minds. New stories began to take over. New missing children appeared in the news. And Ethan's name became just another statistic in the growing sea of unsolved cases. The phone calls became fewer. The tips, which once flooded the police department with hope, grew scarce, and slowly the heartache of the Ross family, though still present, was overshadowed by the daily grind of life. The community, though compassionate, could only carry on. People needed to move forward. The world didn't stop. But the Ross family, they couldn't move on. Craig and Pam, still clinging to the memory of their son, grew exhausted. The endless cycle of waiting for a phone call, hoping for a breakthrough, only to be met with silence. It was like living in a dream they couldn't wake up from, a nightmare that never ended. For them, time had stopped. But for everyone else, it continued. Life didn't pause for missing children. It never did. Ethan's case, once the center of their world, was now just another cold case file in a growing pile of unsolved mysteries. The pain and the grief of losing their son never left, but the hope, slowly, quietly, began to fade. They knew they couldn't give up. But the weight of 4 years without answers threatened to bury them. And then, one day, just like that, everything changed. The year was 2019, 4 years since Ethan disappeared. The world had moved on. The case was a fading memory. But somewhere deep in the bowels of the internet, a video surfaced. An old auction site, one most people wouldn't bother to visit. It was a grainy clip, the kind that would have been passed over by most, but not by the sharp eyes of investigators who had been tirelessly searching for any new lead, any glimmer of hope. The video showed a young man, barely older than Ethan, standing in a dimly lit room, surrounded by artworks. His features were obscured, but something about him felt familiar. The boy's face, his posture, everything about him sent a chill down the spine of the investigator who stumbled across the video. This wasn't just any boy, it couldn't be. The boy in the video looked so much like Ethan. It couldn't be real, could it? Was this just another hoax? Or was Ethan Ross, the missing teenager, somehow alive? Within hours, the video made its way to the Ross family. The hope that had been dimming for years suddenly reignited. Ethan? Could it be? The initial shock of the video's discovery was immediately followed by a wave of disbelief. It felt almost cruel to entertain the possibility that Ethan might still be alive after so much time. The idea of Ethan being found, alive somewhere out there, was both the thing they had hoped for and feared the most. Could he have been held captive all this time, trapped in a life they couldn't even begin to understand? Pam's hands shook as she watched the video over and over. Her heart raced. Could this really be her son after all these years? The uncertainty of the moment was almost too much to bear. Craig, too, stared at the screen in silence, the same question hanging between them. Is this him? The video was the breakthrough they had been waiting for, the lead they had longed for, but never thought would come. But it wasn't enough. No matter how much they wanted to believe, they couldn't let themselves fully surrender to hope without knowing more. Authorities began their investigation into the video, immediately working to trace its origins. It didn't take long for them to identify the location where the video was uploaded. An underground art market, nothing fancy, no big names, but a place where stolen goods and illicit materials were often traded. It was the perfect cover for something far more sinister. The police quickly located the original upload source, and through a series of cryptic online exchanges, they pinpointed a name: Thomas Collins, a man who, on the surface, appeared to be just another art dealer. But everything in his past, the subtle hints, the lack of any real background, suggested something darker. But could this really be the breakthrough they had been waiting for? Or was it another dead end? The investigators followed the trail, slowly at first as they combed through every piece of evidence, tracing the connections. The leads, though faint, were beginning to come together. And then came the moment that would change everything. When authorities zeroed in on an address, Thomas Collins' apartment. Could Ethan be there? Would they finally find him? The time for waiting was over. The investigation was reaching its peak. The officers, with heavy hearts and hope in their eyes, prepared to enter Collins' apartment. But what they found inside would send shockwaves through the investigation, and in turn send ripples through the lives of Ethan's family. What awaited them behind that door, what was hidden inside that small, quiet apartment, was something that would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about Ethan's disappearance. This case went cold for 4 years. How do you think the Ross family managed to hold on to hope all that time? Do you think they were right to keep searching, or should they have moved on? Share your thoughts below. I'm really curious to hear what you think. As the investigation into Thomas Collins' life began to unfold, the truth behind Ethan's disappearance started to take shape. Dark and twisted, just like the man who had orchestrated it. Thomas Collins wasn't just an art dealer. He wasn't some eccentric man lost in the world of paintings and sculptures. No, Thomas Collins was far more dangerous than that. And while his outward appearance was that of a quiet, unassuming gallery owner, a man who blended into society like any other, there was something far darker behind the carefully constructed facade he had built. Born into a troubled family, Collins had always been a manipulator, someone who learned early on how to get what he wanted. He was brilliant, charming, and ruthless, qualities that made him a dangerous predator. By the time he crossed paths with Ethan Ross in 2015, Collins had already honed his ability to control and manipulate people. He had created an art world where the lines between legitimate business and illegal activity blurred, a world where fear was the currency of control. It wasn't just Ethan's disappearance that would come to haunt his family. It was the years of torment that Ethan endured at the hands of Collins. When Collins first abducted Ethan, he did so with chilling precision. The boy riding his bike, unaware of the danger lurking just behind him, never stood a chance. Collins had been watching Ethan for weeks, studying his routine, learning the best time to strike. He wasn't the kind of man to take risks. Everything was calculated. Everything had a purpose. The moment Ethan was forced into that truck was just the beginning of a nightmare that would last far longer than anyone could have imagined. In the beginning, Collins' control over Ethan was brutal. He used violence to establish dominance. But as time went on, Collins realized that true control didn't come from physical pain. It came from fear. Fear of what could happen to Ethan's family. Fear of death. Fear of the unknown. And so he started using psychological manipulation to break Ethan's spirit. He told Ethan that escape was impossible, that any attempt would lead to not just Ethan's death, but the deaths of his parents. He planted seeds of doubt in Ethan's mind, convincing him that the world outside wasn't safe, that the people who cared about him would never be able to help him. Ethan's fear became the chains that held him in place. His mind was the prison, not just the walls of Collins' apartment. Collins used Ethan's love for his family against him, twisting it into a weapon. He made Ethan believe that any attempt to run would only cause harm to those he loved most. Ethan lived in silence for years, too terrified to act. He'd been trapped in a world that wasn't just physical, it was psychological, a prison built from lies, threats, and manipulation. But even as Ethan was forced to create art for Collins' underground operations, pieces that would be sold to the highest bidder, there were moments where his mind began to fight back. There were moments of clarity where he remembered his parents and the life he had before he was stolen away. But those moments were fleeting. And then just when the investigators thought they were getting closer to understanding the depths of the abduction, a shocking discovery came to light. Something so unexpected, so mind-blowing, it would change everything. Ethan hadn't been hidden away in some dark, remote location. No, he had been living in plain sight. For years, Collins had kept Ethan in his own apartment, and no one suspected a thing. To the outside world, Ethan was just another boy. He was seen in public, sometimes even riding his bike around the community. People saw him in the same neighborhood, and no one thought anything was wrong. They assumed he was just another adopted child in Collins' care. Collins had cleverly woven a web of lies, constructing a false life for Ethan. He manipulated the neighbors, the community, everyone who came into contact with them, into believing that the boy they saw was nothing more than Collins' adopted son. He was a quiet, obedient teenager, polite and well-mannered, nothing to suspect, nothing out of place. Ethan lived in that web of deception, constantly trapped between the life he once knew and the one he was forced to live. He had moments of freedom, moments when he was allowed to go out in public, ride his bike, and live as if nothing was wrong. But behind the facade, Ethan was still the missing child, the child the entire community was searching for. His face had been on missing persons posters for years, but no one recognized him. No one knew the truth. For 4 years, Ethan was right there, within reach, but no one knew. Ethan's life had been turned into a nightmare, and the world had no idea. The horror of living in plain sight, it was a chilling revelation. Ethan had been surrounded by people every day, and yet no one could see what had happened to him. The psychological chains were stronger than any physical one. The longer Ethan remained in Collins' control, the more the facade grew, the more the world believed the lie. But how much longer could Collins maintain this twisted masquerade? And what would happen when the truth finally came to light? It had been 4 long years, years of relentless searching, of false hopes and crushing despair. But sometimes even the coldest cases have a way of thawing when least expected. The break came in the most unexpected of ways. A tip, an anonymous call, an untraceable voice on the other end of the line. The details were sparse. The caller didn't say much, only that there was a connection between Thomas Collins and a string of missing children cases. The lead was vague, just a name, just a description of a location. But it was enough. It was all authorities needed. A careful investigation into Collins' past led them to a hidden corner of the art world, a place so far removed from the public eye that no one had suspected a thing. An underground market, a network of stolen children, turned into commodities for the highest bidder. Collins's so-called art dealership was just a cover, a disguise that allowed him to operate in plain sight for years. But now, finally, the authorities had their lead. The team moved quickly. There was no time to waste. They knew what they were dealing with. They'd followed leads before, but this one felt different. This time, they were closer than ever to bringing Ethan home. The police swarmed Collins' apartment complex. They were careful, methodical. The last thing they wanted was to alert Collins before they could fully investigate. The building was quiet, too quiet. No sounds from the inside, no movement. And then, in an apartment on the second floor, the door opened, and what they found inside would shock the world. There, standing in the corner of a modest apartment, was a young man. At first glance, he seemed just like any other teenager. But there was something familiar about him. His eyes, the way he held himself, the posture, the same posture that had once belonged to a young boy lost in time. It was Ethan. The room went still. The officers paused. For 4 years, Ethan's family had been searching for him, and now here he was, standing in front of them, alive but barely. Ethan's face, though older now, still held the same innocence that had been stolen from him. His eyes spoke of years of fear, of a life lived in silence. The officers couldn't believe what they were seeing. They had found him. They had found Ethan Ross. But as they moved closer, preparing to speak to him, Ethan, standing frozen in the corner, spoke. In a voice that shook with fear and uncertainty, he revealed something that no one had anticipated. He wasn't alone. Ethan wasn't the only child caught in Collins' trap. There were others. Ethan's words hit like a thunderclap. There were more victims, more children trapped in the same cruel, twisted reality. As authorities began to search the apartment, they uncovered hidden rooms filled with the remnants of lives destroyed by Collins. Artworks that had been created by the children under his control. Disturbing, eerie pieces that had been sold in an underground market to the highest bidder. But this wasn't just about Ethan. It was about all of them, the children who had been trapped, manipulated, and forced into lives they didn't choose. Ethan's revelation about the other children sent shockwaves through the investigation. Collins had been running a network, a human trafficking ring masquerading as an art operation. The children were coerced into creating art for this underground market. They were kept in plain sight, living ordinary lives, hidden in the shadows of society. Authorities hadn't just stumbled upon a missing child. They had uncovered a dark network, one that stretched far beyond Collins' apartment. How many more were out there? How long had this been going on? The questions piled up, but the answers came slowly. As police began their investigation into the broader operation, the truth about Collins became clearer. The man wasn't just a kidnapper, he was a mastermind. He had found a way to operate right under everyone's noses, using his art dealership as a front for something far darker. His victims had been living in plain sight for years. They had been coerced into thinking they were safe, into thinking that this was just their life now. Ethan had been forced to create art. His talent, his love for painting, had been twisted into something unrecognizable. But despite the years of torment, despite the manipulation, despite the fear that had kept him silent for so long, Ethan was finally free. The weight of that freedom, though, was overwhelming. He was safe, but the scars, both physical and emotional, were far from healed. The investigation continued, and as the pieces of the puzzle came together, the enormity of the operation became clear. Ethan, though safe now, had been just one of many victims, and Collins, who had been hiding in plain sight, was now a manhunt. The authorities knew that they had to shut down the entire operation, arrest every single person involved, and ensure that this would never happen again. But there was something still lurking in the shadows, something far worse than anyone had anticipated. What other secrets did Colin's operation hold? What else had they missed? The moment they found Ethan, his abductor was arrested. What do you think it must have been like for Ethan in that moment, realizing he was finally free? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear how you think he felt. Also, let me know, where are you watching from today? I read every single comment. As the investigation into Thomas Collins continued, authorities began to peel back the layers of his carefully constructed life. What they discovered was far more insidious than they could have ever imagined. Collins had spent years building an underground empire, a network built on the exploitation of children, hidden behind the veil of art. The gallery, the exhibitions, the so-called art dealer, it was all part of a carefully crafted facade, a way to operate in plain sight. To the outside world, Collins was simply an eccentric art dealer, a man who had a knack for finding rare pieces, for cultivating talent, and for creating an aura of mystery around himself. He was well respected in certain circles, admired for his connections and the expensive pieces he displayed in his gallery. His name had appeared in prestigious art auctions, and his exhibits were attended by wealthy buyers who admired the art, not the man behind it. But this wasn't just about art. It was about control. It was about power. Collins had used his position as a respected member of the art world to hide his true intentions. The art he was selling, it wasn't just created by talented artists. It was created by children. Children like Ethan Ross, forced to paint under duress, creating masterpieces that would fetch millions, all while trapped in a life of fear. The pieces they were creating weren't just for sale to the highest bidder. They were the currency in a world of human trafficking, sold not just for profit, but for control. Collins used the art market as a front, as a cover to move his victims undetected. The money he made from the art wasn't just pocketed. It funded a larger network of exploitation. Children were abducted, forced into this hidden world, and subjected to psychological torment to keep them in line. The pieces they created were nothing more than tools of submission, valuable commodities in a dark and twisted business. But how had he gotten away with it for so long? It wasn't just about isolation. It wasn't about keeping his victims locked away in some far-off, undiscovered place. Collins was cleverer than that. He knew how to make his victims disappear in plain sight, how to hide them in the middle of the world they once knew, but now viewed through a lens of fear. The network wasn't just about Ethan. Collins's operations stretched far beyond his apartment and the small community that had once known him. There were more victims, more children, hidden across the country, all forced into this underground art ring. Their faces, their lives, were hidden in plain sight. Some had been taken from families who'd never known the truth. Others had been so expertly manipulated, they didn't even know they were living a lie. Collins had used his influence, his reputation, to keep his operation under the radar. He operated just like any other art dealer, except the art he was selling wasn't the kind you could hang on a wall. It was the work of tortured souls. As authorities dug deeper into Collins' past, they uncovered the true scale of his operation. Hidden rooms in his apartment, trapped children living double lives, and the people who had helped him maintain the facade. The willing accomplices, the ones who helped transport the art, and more disturbingly, those who bought it. As the investigation grew more complex, law enforcement brought in experts to help break down the scope of Collins' operation. We've seen cases like this before, where predators hide in plain sight using legitimate businesses as a cover, said Detective Sandra Whitfield, who had been working on the case from the beginning. But nothing quite like this. Collins knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just selling art, he was selling lives, and he was smart enough to keep it hidden behind a veil of respectability. Most people never thought to look twice. Authorities had no idea just how vast Collins' operation really was until they began to uncover the layers of his network. They found more children, hidden in plain sight, living lives that had been constructed for them. Their captors were always a step ahead, their presence in the art world offering the perfect cover. Expert commentators weighed in on the severity of the case. Dr. Melissa Hart, a child trafficking specialist, provided insight into how Collins was able to manipulate children into submission. These children weren't just abducted, they were conditioned. The psychological manipulation is part of the abuse. Collins didn't just isolate them physically, he isolated them emotionally, making them believe they had no other choice but to comply. He used their love for their families against them, convinced them that leaving would result in harm coming to those they cared about. It wasn't just about art, it wasn't just about money, it was about controlling these children, making them feel powerless, making them believe that the world was a dangerous place, and that their only safety lay in submitting to the will of their abductor. As investigators pieced together the extent of the operation, they began to realize that Collins wasn't working alone. There were accomplices, people who had helped facilitate the trafficking, people who had acted as middlemen in the underground art market, people who knew exactly what was happening but chose to look the other way. One name kept coming up: Aidan Griffin, a wealthy art collector who had been known to purchase pieces from Collins on several occasions. Griffin was a key figure in the art world, someone whose reputation could shield Collins from scrutiny. And it wasn't just art. There were connections to a larger network of traffickers hidden within plain sight, operating under the guise of the art world. The deeper they dug, the darker the truth became. Collins had been living among them, operating his business in broad daylight. The whole world had been blind to his crimes until now, but there was one final piece left to uncover. The moment the doors to Collins' apartment were opened, the floodgates of justice began to swing wide. The arrest of Thomas Collins was just the beginning, the tip of the iceberg. But as police stormed his apartment and his web of lies started to unravel, they quickly realized they were dealing with something much larger, much darker than they had ever anticipated. The police moved swiftly, collapsing the house of cards Collins had so carefully constructed. Officers flooded his apartment, meticulously searching every room, uncovering every hidden corner of his illicit operation. Collins had no chance to escape. The evidence was undeniable. The underground art market, the victims, the psychological manipulation, the trafficking network. It was all there. The officers who had been part of the investigation felt a heavy weight lift off their shoulders. Finally, after all these years, they had him. They had the man responsible for destroying so many lives, including Ethan's. But for Ethan's family, the feeling was far more complicated. Craig and Pam Ross had fought so long for this moment. They had endured so much, hoping, praying for their son to be found, for answers to emerge. Now that the man who had stolen their son was in custody, the weight of that moment was both bittersweet and profoundly unsettling. The arrest was swift, but the charges were severe. Thomas Collins was not only arrested for the abduction of Ethan, but also for a multitude of crimes that spanned years, affecting countless lives. The authorities charged him with kidnapping, human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and more. The case against him was airtight. But Collins wasn't the only one facing charges. As the investigation deepened, authorities arrested several of his associates, people who had helped him run his underground operation, the ones who helped traffic and exploit the children, and those who purchased the stolen art. The police had only begun to scratch the surface of Collins' network. As each person was arrested, the layers of deception and horror were peeled back. The world, for a moment, seemed to hold its breath. The press coverage of the arrest went viral, sparking outrage and shock from every corner of society. News outlets plastered Collins' face across screens, alongside the faces of his victims, the children whose lives had been destroyed by his twisted operation. But no matter how much the authorities did, no matter how many associates were arrested, the fact remained. There was still a long road ahead. Ethan's life had been stolen, and for 4 long years the world had failed to see the truth. Now that justice had finally been served, could it ever be enough? The trial began in late 2019, and for the first time in years, Ethan's family could breathe. Though it was a breath filled with exhaustion, the courtroom was a place of unimaginable pain, but it was also a place of closure. The very man who had taken their son from them, who had tortured and manipulated him for so long, was about to face justice. Ethan sat quietly in the courtroom, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. For him, this wasn't just a trial, it was the final chapter of the nightmare he had lived for so long. Collins, once so powerful, now sat in a courtroom, shackled and broken. His years of manipulation, his years of lying, were finally catching up with him. The sentencing came swiftly. Thomas Collins was sentenced to 74 consecutive life terms in prison. Additionally, he received over 2,000 years for other crimes committed during his reign of terror. It was a sentence so harsh that it left no room for hope of release. He would never see freedom again. But despite the verdict, the sense of closure wasn't as satisfying as it should have been. For Ethan's family, the trauma of the years lost could never be undone. The sentence didn't erase the pain. It didn't give them back the time that was stolen. No amount of justice could restore those years. Craig and Pam in the courtroom sat still. The victory was hollow. The man who had taken their son was now behind bars. But the agony of what they had lost was still alive in their hearts. They had their son back, but not the same son. Ethan had grown from a child into a teenager under the control of his abductor. The person who returned to them was not the same person who had left that autumn evening in 2015. The years spent in captivity had taken a toll, one that couldn't be erased by a conviction or a sentence. The media coverage of the trial continued for days. The story of Ethan Ross, the boy who had been found alive after 4 years, was everywhere. His return was hailed as a miracle. Yet those who truly understood the depth of his suffering knew it was more complicated than that. The media frenzy surrounding the case was intense. Reporters swarmed the Ross family, eager to get a glimpse of the boy who had survived. But for Ethan, this attention was just another layer of the trauma. The world had watched him disappear, and now they were watching him come back. It was too much. Ethan's journey to healing would not be an easy one. No amount of legal justice could undo the damage done. His family, though grateful to have him home, now faced the difficult task of helping him rebuild his life. They had gotten him back, but the scars, physical and psychological, would never fully heal. But as the court proceedings concluded and the world turned its gaze away, there was still one question left unanswered. One lingering mystery that had yet to be revealed. Who else was involved? How deep did Collins' network really go? And were there others still out there, victims whose stories had yet to be told? Collins got a staggering sentence, but do you think it was enough for everything he did? What do you think about the legal outcome? Do you think justice was truly served? Leave your thoughts below. I'm interested to know what you think. Where are you watching from today? I read and replied to all the comments, so let me know. The relief of knowing that Ethan was home was overwhelming, but it was just the beginning. For Ethan, returning home was not a moment of triumph. It was the start of a difficult, painful journey toward healing. The boy who had left his home 4 years ago was now a young man, scarred by the years of manipulation, fear, and isolation he had endured. When he stepped through the door of his parents' house, it wasn't the warm reunion they had dreamed of. There were no joyful embraces, no laughing and talking about the lost time. The reality of his return was far more complicated. Ethan had spent so long under the control of Thomas Collins, living a life defined by fear, that the transition back to a normal life was anything but easy. The world that he had once known, the world of school, friends, and simple pleasures, was now foreign to him. He had missed years of his adolescence, years of growing up. His parents, Craig and Pam, watched him closely, unsure how to support him. They had longed for this moment, for their son to come back, for their family to be whole again. But they now realized that the son they had lost was not the same person who returned. Ethan seemed lost in a world that had moved on without him. He was physically there, but emotionally, mentally, he was elsewhere. His eyes, once bright and full of life, were now filled with the quiet weight of trauma. His movements were slow, his speech hesitant, as if he had forgotten how to navigate the world he once knew. Pam spent her days trying to comfort Ethan, helping him adjust to the life he had been robbed of. But every time she tried to reach out, it felt like there was a wall between them. She knew he was hurting, but how could she help him? How could anyone understand the depth of what he had been through? Craig, too, struggled with how to approach Ethan. There were moments when he saw glimpses of the boy he had raised, the Ethan who loved sports, the Ethan who would laugh at silly jokes, the Ethan who was full of dreams. But those moments were fleeting. What do you say to a child who's been through hell and then brought back to a world that seems just as cruel as the one he escaped? How could a family piece together the fragments of a life shattered by years of abuse? Ethan didn't speak much at first. He spent hours alone staring at the walls of his bedroom, lost in thought. His parents didn't press him, knowing that pushing too hard might cause him to retreat further into himself. They let him take his time, hoping that in time he would open up, trusting them once again. But the silence in the house was deafening. It felt like they were all waiting for something, anything, that would help Ethan heal. As the days went on, there were small moments of progress. Ethan started talking more, but his words were often scattered, his thoughts jumping from one subject to another, never staying in one place too long. He would go to the backyard and sit on the swings just staring into space. Sometimes he would speak of his time in captivity, but only in fragments. He couldn't yet bring himself to recount the full extent of what had happened, but there were glimpses of the Ethan they remembered. One evening while sitting at dinner, Ethan picked up a fork and held it like he was unsure what to do with it. Pam watched, her heart breaking. He was still a child in so many ways, yet a teenager in others. The years he had lost had taken their toll, not just physically, but psychologically. The dinner table was quiet, too quiet. Pam tried to fill the silence with small talk, asking about his day, but Ethan didn't respond. He stared at the plate in front of him, the food untouched. Then suddenly he looked up at her. "I don't know what to do," he said softly. "I don't know how to be normal again." The words hung in the air, and Pam's heart shattered for her son. She wanted to hold him, to take away the pain, but she knew she couldn't. The healing process wasn't something she could fix. It would take time, and Ethan had to take those first steps on his own. Ethan's story didn't just affect his family, it resonated across the country. His rescue sparked a national conversation about missing children, human trafficking, and the psychological toll of abduction. News outlets picked up the story, reporting on the shocking details of Ethan's captivity and the hidden art trafficking ring that had operated under the radar for years. The world was shocked by the extent of the operation. But what truly shocked people was the revelation that Ethan had been living in plain sight, surrounded by the very community that had been searching for him. Ethan's case became a rallying cry for parents, for communities, and for organizations dedicated to the safety of children. The Sean Hornbeck Foundation, established by Ethan's parents during the darkest days of their search, now gained national recognition. People were donating, volunteering, and spreading awareness about the dangers lurking in plain sight. It wasn't just about one boy anymore. It was about the thousands of children who remained missing, whose stories hadn't yet been told. Ethan's family began speaking publicly about the ordeal, sharing their story in the hopes of helping other families. Pam, once so guarded and fearful of the attention, began to speak out, no longer just a mother in pain, but an advocate for children who had been forgotten. Craig, too, stood beside her, his strength now focused on making sure Ethan's ordeal wasn't in vain. The media coverage gave the public a chance to reflect on the horrors that so many children faced, often in silence. The case brought awareness, it brought donations, and it brought hope. Hope that no child would have to endure what Ethan had gone through. But it also sparked a new wave of fear. Fear that any child could become the next victim, that any community could be hiding the next Thomas Collins. But there was still more to Ethan's recovery. The world was watching, and the pressure was mounting. His case had brought about positive change, but could he, as an individual, find peace? Could he heal from the scars that ran deeper than anyone could see? Could Ethan Ross, once a boy who had been stolen, ever truly be free again? When Ethan Ross's case broke into the headlines, it didn't just capture the attention of his local community. It sparked a nationwide conversation. The shock of his rescue, the details of his captivity, and the chilling truth about his abductor sent ripples across the country. People from every walk of life began to look at the issue of missing children with new urgency, questioning how such a horrific crime could go undetected for so long. The media coverage was intense. News outlets, social media platforms, and countless blogs shared Ethan's story. It was everywhere, on television, in the papers, and across the internet. People who had once seen missing children as a statistic now saw them as real, living beings. Ethan's face became a symbol of hope, of survival, but also of the growing threat that still lurked in the shadows. As the story unfolded, a tidal wave of public support emerged. Donations flooded in, not just for the Sean Hornbeck Foundation, but for organizations focused on missing children, human trafficking prevention, and child advocacy. The nation had been shaken awake, and the need for action was clear. Ethan's case illuminated just how vulnerable children were to exploitation, and how easy it was for predators to hide in plain sight. The public response was overwhelming. People who had never even considered the issue of child trafficking now found themselves asking questions. Could this happen in their own community? How could they protect their own children? What systems were in place to help locate missing children? And as Ethan's story reached every corner of the nation, it reached beyond just those directly impacted by his case. His survival became a rallying cry for parents everywhere, a reminder that no child was truly safe unless vigilance was maintained at all levels of society. More and more people began to speak out. Families who had once felt silenced in their grief and despair found strength in Ethan's story. They began to share their own stories, stories of missing children that hadn't made the news, stories of pain that had been hidden in the shadows. Ethan's case reignited the public's interest in missing children cases. It wasn't just about one child anymore. It was about the thousands of children who were still missing. Ethan had become their voice, the one who had survived when so many others hadn't. His story inspired other families to push harder, to demand answers, and to never give up on the search for their loved ones. For Ethan's parents, Craig and Pam, this national outpouring of support felt like a double-edged sword. Yes, they were grateful for the awareness their son's case had brought to the issue of missing children, but the eyes of the world on their family were something they hadn't prepared for. They had wanted their son back, but no one had prepared them for the emotional toll of living in a media spotlight. The road to recovery for Ethan was still long, and now it was further complicated by the constant media attention. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a symbol, and that symbol was now carrying the weight of a nation's hope. But there was still work to be done. Ethan's case had become a catalyst for change, but it didn't end with his rescue. The questions raised by his story lingered. Could this happen again? Were there more Collinses hiding in plain sight? What could be done to prevent it? As the public discourse around missing children reached a fever pitch, lawmakers began to take notice. Ethan's story wasn't just a headline, it was a call to action. The national conversation shifted from sympathy to legislation. The wheels of government began to turn, spurred on by the overwhelming public demand for justice and reform. Ethan's case led directly to new laws and stronger protections for missing children. It was a long, hard battle, but the pressure from the public was undeniable. One of the key outcomes was the expansion of Amber Alert systems across the country, ensuring that the moment a child went missing, law enforcement would be able to mobilize and notify the public much faster than before. Ethan's rescue had demonstrated just how critical time was when it came to locating missing children, and how every second mattered. New guidelines were also put in place to make it easier for law enforcement to investigate suspected trafficking rings. The art world, which had long been a space where wealth and privilege allowed crimes to go unnoticed, was now under scrutiny. Investigations were launched into galleries, auction houses, and other institutions where children could be exploited and trafficked without detection. But the legal reforms didn't stop there. Ethan's case forced society to rethink how we handle human trafficking. It exposed the truth. Trafficking wasn't just something that happened in the shadows. It happened in plain sight, right under our noses. And the laws hadn't been keeping up with that reality. Ethan's story was one of survival, but it was also one of awakening. It opened people's eyes to the dark underbelly of society, the places where predators could operate unchecked, where victims could be hidden, and where the rules didn't apply. His case was a rallying cry for legal change and cultural shifts. Society had to confront the ugly truths it had been ignoring. And the legal battles didn't end with Colin's conviction. The work to dismantle the trafficking networks that had allowed him to operate for so long was just beginning. But amidst the new laws and the national awareness came a haunting question. What had been overlooked? What more could have been done? And how many other children were still out there, waiting to be found? The legacy of Ethan's case would not be measured solely by the number of new laws passed or the awareness raised. It would be measured by how much longer it took for other families to feel the same pain the Ross family had, by how quickly society would shift its focus from one case to the next, and whether it could sustain the momentum long enough to make real, lasting change. Ethan's survival became a beacon, a symbol of hope for other families of missing children, but it also served as a harsh reminder that the fight was far from over. The legal victories, while important, didn't erase the scars of the past. For Ethan, the process of healing, both physically and emotionally, had just begun. And for society, the real question remained: would it continue to fight, or would the next case slip through the cracks? Ethan's story was not over yet. In the years that followed, he would continue to face the long road to recovery. His story would continue to inspire, but would it be enough to prevent future victims from disappearing in plain sight? Ethan Ross's journey was one that no child should ever have to endure. What started as a simple bike ride on a crisp autumn evening in 2015 turned into an unimaginable nightmare. For 4 years, his name became a symbol of loss, of fear, of every parent's worst nightmare. Yet through every dark moment, through the pain, the fear, and the confusion, Ethan survived. His case, once a fading memory, a cold file in an overcrowded police department, was reignited with a new light when an anonymous tip led investigators to Thomas Collins' twisted operation. That tip, that one moment of hope, set the wheels in motion for a rescue that no one thought possible. Ethan was found, but what he returned with was far more than anyone could have expected. For Ethan, the physical scars were only the beginning. The emotional scars would take far longer to heal, but with every small step he took, every conversation he had with his family, every moment of normalcy he reclaimed, he proved that survival wasn't just about escaping the nightmare. It was about finding a way to live after it. It wasn't just Ethan who had been affected by this horror. It was his family too. His parents, Craig and Pam, had fought so long for this moment. But in the process, they had seen their son, their child, become a symbol of hope, of courage, of resilience, but also of the unbearable weight of a past they couldn't erase. No amount of legal victories or public recognition could ever give them back the years they had lost. No sentence, no judgment, no arrest could undo the harm that had been done to Ethan's heart and mind. Yet they held on to the belief that together they could rebuild what had been shattered. Ethan's case didn't just inspire a nation, it brought forth a movement. His story ignited conversations that went beyond just missing children. It became a call to action for families to look closer, to question what was happening in their own neighborhoods. And it didn't stop with Ethan. His survival and the growing awareness that followed shifted how society viewed missing children, how society approached human trafficking, and how parents everywhere began to question the safety of their own children in a world that seemed, for so long, to ignore the darkness lurking in plain sight. But even as Ethan stepped into his new life, one where he could begin to heal, the questions remained. The fight for justice continued, not just for him, but for every child who hadn't been found yet, for every family still searching. Ethan's story isn't just his own. It's a story that belongs to every parent who has feared for the safety of their child, to every family who has gone through the agony of not knowing where their loved one is. Ethan's survival is proof that miracles can happen, but it's also a reminder that there are still so many children out there, waiting for someone to listen, to care, to act. What if it had been your child? What would you have done? The journey doesn't end with Ethan. His survival has opened our eyes to the realities of human trafficking, to the harsh truths about how predators can hide in plain sight. And it's up to us to ensure that we never forget, that we continue to fight for the children who still need us. Ethan's case, his survival, his courage, is a call for action, for vigilance, and for justice. The story is not over. Not for Ethan, not for the other children still missing. The fight continues, and it's one that demands our attention. What will you do to help? What will you do to make sure no child has to endure what Ethan did? The answer's in our hands. The question remains, will we act before it's too late? Thank you once again to all my incredible subscribers who have been supporting this channel as we uncover these haunting, true crime stories. Your support means the world to me. If this story has moved you, give this video a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to come, and I don't want you to miss it. Share this story with anyone who loves solved cold cases and shocking revelations. And make sure to turn on the notification bell so you're the first to know whenever I upload a new video. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. If you want more solved cold cases just like this one, check out our previous videos right here on this channel. There are more mysteries waiting to be solved. Don't miss out.